Hi everyone, welcome to In the Verse, In Conversation Poetry and the State of the Nation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Nisha Ramayya. I'm a lecturer in creative writing, specialising in poetry at Queen Mary, and I'm completely thrilled and honoured to be introducing our panellists and facilitating a discussion with them. I'm just going to read not full-on bios, but just a little introduction to the event and just explain the format, and then we will get started. And I wanted to say before any of that, just that please feel free. The whole theme of this amazing series put together by Aoife and Molly is conversations. The chat is open; it's there. Please feel free to drop in any comments, any emojis, any reactions that you feel are suitable, or contributions that you'd like to make to the discussion. You're very welcome, and we would love to hear from you. So this event is a gathering of scattered tongues. A panel of poets from the UK and the US tonight are going to ask, what is the role of poetry in the national conversation? How can poetry help us to go from personal and collective action in times of crisis? We're going to be joined today by Asia Khatun, poet, founder, and editor-in-chief of Thawra magazine, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in a bit. And I have to also shout out Asia as a QM alumni and extremely amazing former student who we're so honored to have back with us tonight. Kashif Sharma-Patel, who is a fabulous poet, writer, editor at the 87 Press, who focuses on queer and racialized experimental work. And again, we'll drop in some links to their brilliant work as poet and as editor at the 87 shortly. And Kay Rufai, poet, photographer, and filmmaker. And we're very lucky to get to see a short film made by Kay coming up in a bit. So together, we're going to put verse into the national conversation and explore the power of poetry to create solidarity, to offer a place of dissent, and to challenge state-fueled crises. So we're going to kind of move in between conversation, some performance, and then back to conversation again. As I say, I'll repeat again, you're very, very welcome and invited to share questions and comments throughout. We're going to begin by just getting to know our poets. So I've suggested a running order. Kay, if you'd be happy to go first. It would be wonderful if you could just introduce us to your work, maybe through images and video, and also the creative communities that you work with, amongst, and for.
Great. Thank you so much for the initial introduction, Nisha. And I feel really honored to be amongst some really incredible artists on this panel as well. Yeah, I guess just to give context around my work, I'm a multimedia artist that uses photography, poetry, and film to explore myriad themes from masculinities and how that impacts the versions of serious youth violence that are impacting young people, specifically young Black boys, and also a lot of my work, how that intersects with mental health as well. And I think over today's conversation, images and films and poems of mine are really going to give more context to a lot of the work that I do. The communities that I work on behalf of, with, in a co-collaborative way, are the Black and I guess male identifying community. For the most part, I do a lot of work with young boys and men in the prison institution, the youth offending institution, and also mainstream education. A lot of my work is about using public health designed happiness research to create creative arts programs that improve and provide autonomy for young Black boys to improve their mental well-being, but also to challenge the societies and the systems that are supposed to put these things in place for them. So yeah, for me, I think poetry and art specifically has a huge part to play in the political landscape of the world that we're shaping right now. And it just goes hand in hand. So I think over the rest of today's panel talk, we shall get into some of those themes much deeply.
Yeah, that will be amazing. Thanks, Kate. And if I might just go off book a bit and just ask you a question about that before we go on to Asia and Kashif. Did was your introduction to poetry always so politically informed or kind of community oriented, or was there a particular turning point for you where that became so central?
I mean, it's really interesting because, again, I think we can really delve further into the, I guess, the hierarchical presentation of what kinds of poetry is valued in our society. So my early introduction to poetry was through rap, and that's through Tupac, which I never called poetry because, again, the powers that be, the gatekeepers of what poetry is and the poetics of language is not really colloquialized, and all of those terminologies that I was resonating with from a emotional perspective of expressing one's emotion, that version of poetry was not heralded in that same way. So for me, my earliest introduction, even though I hated English in school, I loved words, but it was just the manner in which that was actually delivered to me. So my earliest introduction to poetry was about somebody speaking about things that resonated with my lived experience, somebody that spoke about things that were community driven, that were rooted in a lot of the feelings and emotions that I had. A Black man speaking about injustices, speaking about his lack of father figure in his direct lived experience, and how that impacted the world that he engaged in and how the world also saw him. So that was my initial introduction to poetry, as it were. In a retrospective manner, did I know later that that was actually poetry? I just loved somebody who expressed authentically in a way that was genuine to their emotions and actually shattered the perceptions of what masculinity was, in terms of being quite stoic and non-expressive in their emotions. So for me, that was my earliest introduction to poetry. And then I started to realize that actually it was so fundamental around me in really seeing how people navigated their lived experiences and challenged the status quo and the systems that existed to confine and to disproportionately impact the communities that I grew up in. So that I realized that there was a direct link there with things that I resonated with on the emotional level, but then seeing the impacts that they had on the societal level too.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I'm sure that will resonate with lots of people of finding that poetry wasn't necessarily the thing that they learned in schools, but was something that you identify as all around you, is informing your thought, your passion, your relationships to people, but you can only label it that with
Right.
some hindsight. So that's brilliant. Thanks so much for that introduction to your work. I also just wanted to say hello. We are joined by our fourth participant, Meera Dasgupta, and I just very short introduction is the 2020 Youth Poet Laureate of the US, and we are so thrilled that you could join us, Meera. And just so you know, we're just currently going around introducing our work. So Asia, could I ask you the same question, just to introduce your work for us, please, and the creative communities that you work with, amongst, and for?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for that amazing introduction. So hi everyone, I'm Asia, and I run an online literary magazine called Thawra, which means revolution in Arabic, and it's a platform where ethnic minorities are able to really showcase their creative work. So everything from poetry to short stories to more critical based things like essays and reviews. It's a pretty simple idea, but it holds a lot of power in the sense that, you know, there are tons of talented BAME creators from an ethnic minority background, and particularly young BAME creators as well. And I feel like they aren't often given many chances to have a creative outlet, to have a place, and also to feel confident in sharing their work. And because often when you start off, it's quite a vulnerable place to be, and you're not quite sure which platform to take to share it. So in terms of that, that's the kind of community that Thawra is there for. My recent work, I'm writing a series called Literature Still Catering for the Orientalist Gaze. Bit of a mouthful, but if you just zoom out, it's a bit more about literature, but I guess poetry is very much part of that world. And I think it talks about how nation states have had a hand in shaping the perception of the Muslim in the West and who the Muslim is, and to kind of broaden that to POC as well. And it kind of delves into the history of, you know, why we're fed these stereotypes and how we've transitioned from the colonial to the neo-colonial with these states, and, you know, how they're exploiting the East or anything that isn't the West in terms of that. So yeah, those are the things I've been up to, and with Thawra as well.
That's amazing to hear about. And our behind the scenes wizard, James, is going to drop in a link for us so you can all go and check that out and read some of Asia's series of articles. And just Asia, to ask you a similar question as a follow-up, just when you were thinking about Thawra, did that come about noticing a particular absence? Did it come about through conversation with peers who felt that there wasn't a space for your voices? Could you tell us a bit more about the kind of foundation of the project?
Yeah, sure. I think whilst I was at university, I noticed that, because obviously I did creative writing as well with you, and a lot of my peers and myself, we noticed that we didn't really have any platforms to share our creative work with, specifically poetry as well, because a lot of the things that are out there, they're quite, they're not really interested in kind of sharing young people's poetry. I felt like there wasn't a platform like that, and a lot of my peers as well, you know, you could submit your work to the university magazine. Sorry, I'm just having a look at the screen there, but yeah, so you can submit your work to university magazines and whatnot, but there wasn't a kind of formalized process where it there was something that had a bit more of a global reach, that could reach like worldwide to whoever online. So Thawra kind of just came out of that, really needing a space to share my own work as well as my peers. And I think with all the time we've had in the past year or so, I thought, why not? Let's just do it. Let's go with it. And yeah, so it just happened.
Yeah, it is, I mean, and it's amazing to kind of to see a need for something and to create it yourself, and to create it for yourself, for your own work and for others. And I think what's also needs to be mentioned is so many publications are like inaccessible because you have to pay to even enter into a particular competition or to submit. So there's something really open about Thawra in that sense too, which is brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction. And now shall we turn to Kashif? Kashif, so please introduce your work for our audience, and could you please tell us about the creative communities that you work with, amongst, and for?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks for having me, Nisha. So I'm a poet, and yeah, I've written quite a bit, and well, a little bit, and performed. I'm working towards a full-length collection, hopefully next year. And I'm also a freelance writer, so I do critical kind of criticism, particularly in music, literature, art, and often at the interface between the different cultures, so between sonic, visual, and textual cultures. And yeah, as you mentioned, like specifically around like racialized and queer kind of people and communities and artwork. And then the third thing I do is I'm a publisher, so I'm kind of co-founder of the 87 Press, which so you've been involved with a little bit, Nisha, recently, and it's effectively it's a press for experimental poetry or literature, but specifically, or more emphasis on creating communities for marginalized people within that group. So for POC, for people of color, for neurodiverse people, and for queer people in particular, to be able to have a space to do more experimental work. And yeah, and some of that was developed. I'm the co-founder, my other co-founder is Azad Sharma, and both of us kind of felt there was a lack of space for the kind of work we were writing ourselves in terms of poetry. And we thought, okay, well, we could set up something quite, initially very small, just a poetry night and a chat book. But then it's kind of snowballed, and we've got kind of, I forget the number. We've got like 7 or 8 books now, maybe 9, mainly poetry, but one non-fiction book and some short fiction as well. So we're kind of going in different directions, and it's doing like pretty well, I think. And yeah, so yeah, in terms of like the creative communities, it feels like it's growing. It feels like we're trying to involve lots of different people. Yeah, and it's just kind of, it's interesting, at least for me, to be a writer and then to be involved in the kind of editing process, and also to be a critic and to be involved in the editing process and the process of engaging with like different individuals from different perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know the 87, they're huge. They have canvas bags joining the extremely competitive best bags for books market and winning. And it's, yeah, it's so brilliant that you're demonstrating exactly that thing of creating community around publishing as a practice, but also around shared political and aesthetic concerns, which I'm sure we'll go into more. And just to ask you this, a similar question, could you tell us a little bit about your origins, or how you found your people in this sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wasn't that in tune with poetry very much, a bit like what I think Kay was saying, like, but there was a lot of it around me, and maybe I've come at it from, like, I was quite politically motivated early on, and then I went to university and I got into, like, I did history, so I was really interested in like social history, political history. I got very like politically involved on campus, and then kind of got a bit what do you call it? Not disenfranchised, but disabused of the whole thing. I was like, there's you know, it wasn't fulfilling, you know, that there's more to life than, there's more to a situation than just the kind of language of politics. And similarly, the language of theory wasn't doing it for me. I was reading some like critical theory, and it was getting there, but I wasn't maybe in the right headspace to do something with it. It wasn't immediate enough. And so, yeah, I ended up in like, yeah, being exposed to different forms of poetry, and then just writing. And I wasn't really writing for any specific reason. There was no like, I didn't think I was a poet. I was just writing this fragmented stuff. It was just processing a lot of what I was reading, a lot of stuff I was experiencing, stuff that's happening on the street, you know, stuff to do with, you know, all sorts of different, like my identity, with my, you know, relationship with certain stuff that's going on politically and culturally and so on. And then, you know, making it into like an aesthetic object. At some point I was like, okay, it's really interesting that this just operates on its own as an aesthetic object, you know. And then, yeah, my co-founder of the press, I knew him from school actually, and he was like, oh, what you're doing is, he said to me, look, what you're doing is poetry. And he was a poet himself. And then he put me on to like a few people, gave me a kind of literary precedence to say, okay, there's stuff that's gone on that's similar to what you're doing. And it can help you to process and mediate what you're working on. So, you know, I kind of see like poetry is like, it's a process. It's not really necessarily my end point, but it's kind of where I feel quite comfortable, and I've met a lot of decent people in. Yeah.
Thank you. And I love that, and also think it's really important that the point at which one feels comfortable to call what we're doing poetry, like sometimes it needs to come from outside. It's a really difficult identity to claim, actually, being a poet. But then once you claim it, you don't want to let it go. Or at least that's my experience. Thanks so much, Kashif. And Meera, would love to welcome you to the conversation, and just ask you if you could please introduce your work. Just tell us a little bit about the creative communities that you work with, amongst, and for.
Okay, so hi, if you don't know me, my name is Meera. I actually just got out of class because it is 2:50 in New York City currently. So I'm a high school senior and I'm 17. And I go to Stuyvesant High School, which is in downtown Manhattan. So a lot of my poetry communities are based within New York City and in the United States in general, though having international conversations like these are always ones that I welcome and gratefully, because I do love talking to people about globalized perspectives as well. And I feel as if in terms of my work, I definitely work within different sectors in terms of bringing youth voices to poetry. I took different classes in gender and sexuality and philosophy and urban education in order to bring those topics into my writing as well, because I feel as if movements now are very much so intersectional. We're becoming more cognizant of the fact that many of our identities have different means of which they are affected or impacted by issues that we see within the world. So currently within the pandemic or in the virtual space, I've been discussing many aspects of my own identity as an Indian American woman living during this time and as US Youth Poet Laureate, which I should have mentioned earlier as well, but currently I am the US Youth Poet Laureate for 2020. So that has been a part of what I'm utilizing as my work and as my platform. And per Youth Voices, I've definitely been working on anthologies as well, like in terms of youth voice, because I'm on many youth advisory councils from the Human Impacts Institute. I'm working as a United Nations Global Goals Ambassador for Life on Land, or SDG 15. So I'm definitely becoming more in tune with nature as well, because I'm in upstate New York. There is a river right outside of my window. I'm surrounded by nature. And I think considering that the world has been put on pause, we also have to consider that climate change and the climate crisis is also still happening. Even though our lives may be moving in a different place, there are still issues that we have to work towards, and still different problems and different infrastructures that we have to learn to deconstruct. So I think this time is really one at which we can look within ourselves and take time to reflect and how we can cause a change within our own minds before we cause it within the world too.
Thank you so much. Firstly, it's extremely cool that you've just come out of class and are like flying in to take part in this international conversation. And secondly, I am so jealous that you have a river outside your window. Like, I think anyone else who's tuning in from London is extremely jealous as well right now. But thank you. Your work sounds amazing. And thanks for that introduction. And actually, if I may just kind of ask a little bit more about that, and also as a kind of segue to the next part of the conversation, which is about the relationship between what we write and what's going on in the world, and if and writing sometimes in response to crisis. If for some poets that is a way of thinking through or responding, sometimes it's a way of even trying to heal. But for others, it can be there's a crisis happens and you just need space and even like a time without words, without thoughts, just to feel, and then you come back and write sort of more retrospectively. And I was just wondering, with that question and thinking about your work as Poet Laureate, do you have particular responsibilities as Poet Laureate to respond to crisis in the moment, or how does that work as part of that, like the responsibilities of that role?
Yeah, I feel as if when I was first announced as the US Youth Poet Laureate, I fell out of my chair. That was the first thing that happened. But the second thing was that I did feel a sense of responsibility within this time, because with media and different news presences becoming the way in which we consume different things, I felt as if it was something or a responsibility of mine to be able to uplift people who may not have a platform, because in this space, I always constantly also think about accessibility. Like, the fact is that having a computer, being on Zoom and having all of these devices in order to discuss with other people is a privilege. So that's something that I try to imbue within my work as well, because when I speak, I know that whether it's on a stage or on a Zoom screen, I know that I'm not just speaking for myself. Sometimes I'm speaking to empower different communities. So there definitely is that sense of the fact that I was given this privilege, and how do I use this privilege in order to help or uplift other people or other young people, especially within my New York City community, in the US, or even the world. And I feel as if another aspect of that, when you're talking about healing and responding, I also think that a lot of poetry, sometimes we consider it as always being for consumption. And I know you're talking about healing. So I think that sometimes even responding can be responding for yourself first, and just trying to conglomerate everything that's happening outside of you into yourself, and trying to sit with that for a few moments, or even if it takes days, because I know so many things have been happening right now. But I do think it's important that if you have privilege, or you have a platform, that you use that privilege or use that platform, because in a way you can utilize that as a form of mutual aid, like giving people your platform to use as a way in order to bring their lived experiences into your spaces as well. So yeah, I definitely agree with all that you said, and I'm really excited to hear from everyone else as well.
Thank you. That's brilliant, and it's interesting. Already we've heard the different ways in which everyone here is using their voice in order to either provide platforms or amplify other voices, whether that's through kind of particular organizing or publishing, or just even within the work itself. So thank you. That's really opened things out beautifully. And I might then turn back to Kay to come in here on just the relationship for you between writing and crisis, if I can be that sort of dramatic. And do you find it helpful to write in times of crisis? And yeah, if you could talk more about that particular relationship for you and how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think, yeah, what I realized, again, the power of the retrospective feature in our lives is that I always did that to process complex emotions that I couldn't verbally articulate. That was a trained behavior because I didn't grow up with my father. There was a lot of things that were completely impacting me and my mental, emotional, and spiritual growth that I needed to articulate in a what I now know to be a poetic fashion. So for me, because that's been kind of inherent within how I process things, especially in light of what's happened from last year, I guess that's always been happening if you are somebody who's directly belonging to communities of the disenfranchised and disproportionate impacted. That's always been happening, but I think last year put it on, I guess, global stage, and also the added context of the fact that everybody's lives were paused, as it were. So I guess in light of that, there was a myriad of emotions that I'm sure a lot of us can really attest to in terms of what was going through a lot of us, but specifically Black folks. There was a consistent, I guess, emotional battering that I definitely was experiencing, that I think there was complex emotions that were unable to be articulated or processed in the regular way that I guess I now know how to as a man. But this particular period in my life required artistic representation for my voice in a way that allowed me to process, but also allowed me to find meaning in that processing. So for me, you know, political incidents definitely are the ways, and the artistic output that comes from it are the ways in which I can emotionally process. And also the privilege we have as artists, which I think Meera spoke about, also artists that have platform, whatever the size of that platform is, we provide, just like the Lauryn Hills and the Tupacs did for me, they provided a platform to almost allow my voice to be heard. Even if it's their voices, I'm like, that's exactly what I feel like. That's exactly how I feel at this moment. And for me to have the opportunity to be able to, in some cases, collaboratively explore these stories with some of the young people that I work with and the young Black boys, and use the poetic mediums to articulate the collective feelings, or in some cases, express and explore my own emotions that then chime and directly relate to specific young people who are really in the thick of it and don't have the language to articulate that emotional complexity, for me has been a powerful cathartic process, you know, to be able to undergo within myself, but also liberatory in terms of allowing me to seek some sort of utopia, even only just in my imagination, or even explore complex feelings of anger and pain, and in some way kind of exercise that from my physical being through the art. So that's definitely been my kind of journey in terms of political events, inspiring artistic response in my soul first, and I think eventually there is a output, whether that's only for me to kind of engage with, or that's something that then is shared on a public platform for others to engage and respond to.
Thank you so much. That I don't know. I've been thinking about Lauryn Hill a lot lately, and her line about being like Nina Simone and defecating on your microphone. Yes. And I'm just thinking that too is a way to use a platform. Like sometimes that's what you need to do, and she just says it just beautifully. And yeah, so thanks for making me think of Lauryn Hill again. But also for what you said, which is so important about being, depending on what community you're part of, crisis isn't an option. Right, if you sometimes, if you're writing about your particular life, your circumstances, where you come from, who you're surrounded by, you have no choice but to write about crisis, and that, you know, that also is a mark of privilege too, to be able to choose not to. And right. So thank you for bringing that in. Thanks, Kay. I'll turn to Asia now about, for you, the relationship between your writing and crisis.
Yeah, sure. I think at the moment, with a lot more of the critical work I'm looking at, is to show people how deep-rooted in history that certain political moments that we're having, you know, what we've had for such a long period of time, they're kind of amalgamating, is to kind of express how deep-rooted, like I said, it really goes back. And I think when political things inevitably happen, you know, that are outright injustices, I think when you're a writer, it's really hard to ignore it, because writing and poetry it's a tool of dissent that in this country, at least, like Meera and Kay have said, we have the privilege of using, and it's something that it's in our power to do so and to express with the platforms that we do have. And at the end of the day, we're not politicians who have the power to change legislation, you know, but we do have the power to reach, you know, our own communities when working collectively. And we saw that with, you know, as Kay mentioned, the Black Lives Matter movement last year. It's been going on for decades, but because of that kind of global mobilization and communities, the Black community being able to globally, collectively work, it just shows the kind of power that it does have. In terms of having a platform as a publisher as well, I think when political things do happen in the world, creatives need a place to really convey their messages, because, you know, if we look at other medias like mainstream media, we know as disenfranchised communities that we're not going to be represented accurately, to say the least. So it's really important that we do have places like mine and Kashif's, where young creatives from different communities, the queer community, the BAME community, that they have a place where they can really express how these injustices are making them feel on a personal level, but also kind of show the global impact of what's going on. And often that those kind of stories are what's ignored in mainstream media. So yeah, I think that's a really important place for when political things do happen, that the creative industry, that side of the creative industry, is there for poetry specifically as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you made a really important point too about who you're speaking to, because you're right that sometimes you don't have a direct telephone line to the politicians who can make legislative change. And sometimes there's a feeling that if you can't do that, then you're not doing anything, you know, that the poetry is not making any impact. But that's not true. It's, as you said, exactly, it's about speaking back to your own communities. That in itself is a form of speaking to power, I think, and a form of resistance. And so I really appreciate you kind of emphasizing that aspect of it, that it's kind of, the conversation is particularly grounded in the people that you're with. It's horizontal. It doesn't have to be vertical to do something really important. And I was just wondering too, if there are any particular poets or writers that you turn to yourself, or that have kind of inspired how you think about writing in relation to crisis.
I think for the past 2 years or so, she's quite a new poet. Her name's Suhaima Manzoor Khan, and she came out with Post-Colonial Banter actually a year ago or so. And she's a poet that, in terms of British politics and things that happen over here, as well as worldwide, she has a way of just being very in tune with the dynamics of the how things seem to function up there. And I feel like in an oppressive state, even if it's sinister in how our Western states function, her poetry always hits the nail on the head in regards to how ethnic minorities often feel living in Britain. And, you know, whether it's socio-politically, it's about racism, Islamophobia, or economically, it's about the class systems that, you know, are impacting certain communities. So I think when I read her work, it's always, if I'm not writing something myself, reading somebody else's work that kind of shares that same sentiment of like what I'm thinking about, it's really good. Yeah,
that's a great reference. I'll drop in Suhaima's website in the chat, but and she does it with wit as well, and like this kind of, there's this kind of amazing blend of humor and like completely blistering critique, and in fact, as a beautiful way to transition to Kashif, she's read at the 87's reading nights back when there were things like public events in rooms. Kashif, could we turn to you and hear about your the relationships for you between writing and crisis? Thanks so much, Asia.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it's a difficult question, really. It's a difficult thing to think about. Like, obviously, I kind of mentioned that poetry came to me in a sort of crisis. Certainly a crisis of, you know, personal, but, you know, personal crisis is always something broader, right? It's never just you. There's always structural issues or social issues going on around you. I like one of the texts that really influenced me was the Undercomments, actually, which might be a good place for me just to situate what I try and do. So that's Undercomments by Fred Moten and Stefano Hani, and one of the things that they talk about is like this idea of like the text as a social space. So it's like the text is this place where you go and you can hear the voices of other people, and you can hear the different histories, and you can, you know, it's almost like a virtual web, you know, outside of the digital, right? So it's like, it's a place where different ideas are being thrown around, different musics and songs are being thrown around, and they expand that to think about, okay, how do we can think about music in that way, we can think about all sorts of other things in that way. And for me, that was really interesting, because it was like, okay, so this thing that you develop out of your own sort of situation is then part of this much wider circumstance, a much wider constellation, right? It's like a constellation of stuff. So I think I've always tried to err away from saying this is political, partly because I've often found the language of politics very dry. You know, it kind of homogenizes, right? to some extent. But then if you think about politics in terms of like organizing people, and people defending themselves, people coming together, right? The kind of stuff we're talking about, then obviously everything that you're doing in terms of poetry, in terms of publishing, in terms of writing is political. But I'm always kind of wary to kind of to jump into that. And partly I also, you know, one of the things I guess we're talking about in terms of crisis is always ongoing, right? So with, you know, with say we're talking about Black Lives Matter, you know, there's an eruption, but as we know, the eruption happens, but it's a build-up, and it's not like the eruptions come from nowhere. We know that there's a build-up of you know, not just decades, but you know, even longer really. So yeah, my relationship to crisis is difficult. Is I guess what I'm saying, but I do definitely write in times of crisis, but I possibly don't write about it, right? So it's again comes back to this idea of process, right? Like trying to process my subjectivity. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Do you ever have an experience of reading back on some work and realizing, oh, that was actually about something that was going on at the time, but I didn't kind of name it? Or
I think I try and I think I probably know what it's about, but I try and mediate it through something else, right? So one, the writing is one mediation, but second, it might be like mediating through a different poet, you know, being influenced by somebody else and going, okay, I'm going to try and embody them for a little bit and think about their work. So, you know, I quite often I like to just pick up a volume of someone that I like, and you go into this kind of it's like, you know, like a trance-like state, which is a weird way to put it, right? But you open something, you're kind of reading along, you're kind of you know, when you read impressionistically, right? When you read something and you're not looking for meaning necessarily, but you're looking for experience, right? You're looking for feeling. And sometimes when I read like that, I can then write like that very quickly, and I'll just do it, right? So, and that's the more interesting moments for me, because it's like, okay, I've done it through two things. I've done it through me writing and then me through somebody else, and then it's interesting what comes out of that. And and like I said, like I kind of, because I see the crisis is ongoing, it'll be interesting to see maybe if I look, I haven't really, well, I'd be meaning to look back on stuff I've written a few years ago. So it'd be interesting to look maybe at the longer view, like 4 or 5 years rather than like 1 year. Because like I've read stuff that I wrote, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, and it feels very relevant and fresh. Like I mean, I'm going to read a poem that I wrote even, I think 2 or 3 years ago, but still it feels very fresh. Feels like I'm still in that same kind of mode. So I wonder if, I don't know, what would happen if I maybe finish a collection or something, whether that would change drastically.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely, I'm sure that there's something about lockdown where everything feels somewhat frozen. But I think what you were saying too, I love about being kind of receptive in an impressionistic way to text, because it's true too that we might be able to read back on earlier works and think, oh, I was reading that at the time, or I was listening to that music at the time, or I just seen this and it was going round and round in my head. So yeah, there's ways in which texts are also kind of documents of other voices, but also just other things that are going on in our daily lives and our environments and things, which kind of captures that continuity of crisis, as you were discussing. Thank you so much, Kashif. So shall we turn to the performance part of the evening and have some readings, and we're going to see a film, which I'm really excited about. Meera, would you be happy to kick us off? with a short poetry reading, 5 minutes or so, anything that you feel inspired to share with us.
Yeah, sure, that sounds good. I'm just going to scroll to something that I want to read. Okay. This is something new that I wrote. It's definitely a draft, but I feel as if reading it into a space has always helped me in this, and I feel like this is definitely a moment at which I can share it. Water guns. There is no simple silence. Here the first shrieks take to the sky before the shooting begins. The others too far underwater to breach immediately before you hear all of them arcing at once. Piercing, murky, cold. Light stolen into the crooked teeth of children and the whiteness settling between their teachers' lips. I am angry and afraid of being my father's daughter in America, dodging the spray of bullets. The shipwrecked souls, how they laughed when we cocked our guns at each other, not knowing whether water would become real bullets or if our sons would become real men. And as I stare at the boy in front of me, the whites of his eyes remain as distant as the shore where they first landed. A small burning red line, an arm wrestle on the first day of school, the sound of loss as my hand smacks the table. I do not cry when my fingers bend in protest or when he forces me to yell mercy as they conquer the playground. As I am forced to run, not wanting to be caught by another monster, wanting to be born from these skid marks, this blood that blisters on sunny days and hums like a familiar reckoning, where a little girl says moo and the faucet drips once, as someone's son lifts a real gun and laughs on this playground and reduces his brother to rain. And that is a first draft that I wrote. And it came out of the fact that I was writing a manuscript, and it was a lot about migration and just being between two different countries as Indian and American and living across oceans. So I felt like I had to write it into being, because right now in the United States, there's so many different things happening. Like we talked about the Black Lives Matter movement, and now there's an increase in Asian American violence, I know, in the US as well, and even across different countries, really. So that's where this poem was born out of. And I think another poem that I can read quickly is one that's more uplifting. And it is about the climate crisis. And I felt as if I needed to write it because writing a macro issue into a poem has always been something that I always struggled with. But this was one that I wrote out of being from, as I said before, living upstate as well around nature. Lineage. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. A Native American proverb. There is a mother here. Her skin has known the salt of broken oceans. Her hands have traced the sun until it became her. She learned respect from a father and his hands, how the bones of dead flowers made their garden a burial ground. Her body was her family's burial ground, her mouth an untamed flame. It escaped and left her with a vase. In it, her reflection appeared and shattered. There is a brother here. He's learned to breathe air as dark as his skin. There are no lights in a city of stars that do not reach him. Some days he feels paper weight. In his dreams he is flying. He's forgotten the smell of grass and his mother. He's forgotten the sounds of the wind, what it means to fly. In his dreams he carries a star in his pocket, but it burns from the inside out. It reminds him of himself, that there is a burning within him. There is a father here. He overflows into his mother's garden. Her flames lick his stubborn skin as he swallows the ocean whole. He writes odes to himself until his blood becomes a dead rose. And as the sea levels rise, as they run like a crimson-mouthed psalm, as children curl like wayward leaves, as storms shake their sea blue hands, as these hands overturn burial grounds, as burial ground become his mother, a father becomes a son in mourning. There is a daughter here. She's been taught how to sustain on seeds, but to never settle for them, to treat the grounds as she treats her body, to till the earth until she too is the sun. When morning arrives, she finds the shattered reflections of her mother and recalls the pieces. Countless oceans converging where she stands, you can hear an echo of lineage, the sound of 1,000 daughters, mothers, sons, and fathers. How they become a garden, how their voices bloom among the scattered bones and carry like seeds to wind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The audience can't clap, so please imagine an auditorium is clapping with my clap. That was spine tingling, Meera. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's spine tingling. I feel like I'm in an auditorium, except I can't see any of my audience. Kay, are you gonna show us your film now, or read something for us, or a little bit of both?
I would play the film and have the imagery of the pictures that I've sent through, have those come in afterwards, and then I guess I could give further context to that, and then depending on how things go, perhaps I might read something at a later date potentially, but yeah, at a later time, I mean. But I think it's probably, yeah, just playing a video, the film, and then the series of images, perhaps a series of images first, and then the film afterwards, then give context afterwards.
That sounds brilliant. Wizard James is on it. Thanks, James.
I want you to just arrest the feelings and the emotions that these images are evoking within you, and I guess perhaps afterwards we can explore that a little bit more. Thank you, Wizard James. And
as the past cradles my hopelessness in its warm embrace, the air of despair juxtaposes against the breathlessness evoked by an "I can't breathe" sign, held up by a young black boy I want to believe is older than 13 years old, but the baby hairs and missing teeth suggest otherwise. For a moment, I'm lost in his eyes as I begin to see the world through it. Rose-tinted glares from his favorite Black Panther sunglasses help bring a filtered optimism that defies reality. Reality as I know it, reality as you know it. His uncalloused soft palms hold onto hope like grudges of families past, or better yet, roller coaster handlebars from a now distant summer trip to Alton Towers, where pandemics didn't alter his innocence and youthful bliss. I too want to hold onto this hope, but my calloused hands from gripping tightly onto ideas of equality that always seem to slip through make it an impossible task. But he looks down onto the strong shoulders of his Jamaican grandma, on which he's firmly placed. He feels the wind rush through her hair, her skin, and her DNA. He feels her pain, her strengths, and her held restraints. Knowing her actions, however justified, determine how high his head is raised. I too imagine, for a brief moment, how many shoulders I sat on, How many held restraints enabled me to see further ahead than my friend Femi, who was never told his story, who was never shown his story, the true his story. Seeing through these rose-tinted sunglasses indulges me in a vision of the future, the black future, that sat firmly on the shoulders of his story, black history. The true black history that excavates truths and holds you accountable for your lies and misinformation. The true black history that unearths pains as much as it unearths the gold many of our ancestors were slain for. The true black history that recounts our footprints and handiwork in the very grounds you take the credit for. The true black history that uncloaks the facades we are clothed in as a devious tapestry of lies, so we can continue to stand on strong shoulders, past and present. And only then can we clearly and brightly see the black future he deserves to see, even when the rose-tinted sunglasses come off. This is my black future.
Thank you very much for that, Wizard James. Yeah, I think that the piece, I guess, speaks to the initial, one of the questions that was asked earlier about, to me, Nisha, about crisis and how that, is connected or related to my writing. And this piece was born out of that. This was a piece I wrote last year as a result of one of the pieces that I wrote as a result of processing the layers of emotional complexities that were, flowing through my body and my soul. This was a way for me to try and imagine what, again, and I think that's the beautiful thing that art provides us, the ability to allow our imagination to lead us into a faraway land from what the realities are, albeit for a period of time. For me, that was what I needed for my soul to be able to process what I was presently feeling, but also to imagine what the realities of a utopic period that I have very much a strong optimism for in light of my measured cautiousness in this period of time that we are in. So for me, that piece was just about exploring, especially because a lot of my work works with young Black boys, and which is why the series of images that we see is a radical disposition of Black masculinities, which is, I guess, counter-stereotypical to what we are visually associating of this to this demographic, especially in the popular media that we all consume. So for me, the work that I do to curate a visual narrative that is truly reflective of the myriad of Black expressions of young Black boys that I encounter every day is another radical response in a poetic way, but in a visually poetic form. And this film was an extension of that in a way that I wanted to use body movements to convey the emotional complexities of what I was trying to explore and express, but also use the words to take the dancers on a journey that I think unlocks a range of emotions that just the vocals alone perhaps wouldn't have done. And for me, that's one of the reasons why I work in multiple media, to be able to use a combination of emotional journeys as a tapestry that kind of is interwoven through the layers of different art forms that evoke particular emotions. For me as an artist, that's one of the most powerful ways in which I kind of felt connected to a lot of material from as I mentioned, some of the people that really inspire my work. But thinking about the multiple layers of interwoven art, which to me is all poetry, but not just in a verbal way. And that's why, for me, I like to work using multiple mediums to express my my poetic expressions in that way. So yes, I think for me, those images kind of stand as a radical reimagination of what Black masculinities and the humanization of what Black identities can be, and question us that receive that image as to why, one, whatever emotions that we feel, why is it that those emotions are not, why are those emotions few and far between? Why are these visual imagery not ones that we are accustomed to in our everyday lives? And why is it that seeing these images evoke such strong emotions in some of us, if that's the case? And what can we do, and what role can we play in inserting these visual narratives of Black masculinities and Black identities in a world that favors the dehumanization, which makes the criminalization and ultimate lynching of Black bodies much more commonplace?
Thank you, Kay. That was really, I mean, incredibly powerful, and I want to say beautiful, but there's also something so destabilizing about saying beautiful when it comes from a place of great violence and brutality and grief. But that's also what your work was kind of, those were the kind of complex feelings it was evoking with the juxtaposition of the kind of the imagery, the dance, the music, the words, the way that they spoke to each other and also kind of clashed with each other. Really amazing work. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Did you feel in the mood to share a poem, or maybe later on?
Yeah, maybe later on. I think for me, again, because I don't, just like the conversation we're having with Kashif, the identification as a poet is not something that is a huge part of my identity. I see myself as an artist. I can deliver poems and poetry. I choose not to a lot of times because I think my work is a marriage of multiple mediums, and I rarely stand on stage to recite a poem. I tend to use poetry in an interwoven sort of body of work that feeds a particular imagery. But I have, myriad of poems that I could read if the time fits. But I just feel like the piece and the imagery with the words kind of, for me, convey the narrative and the emotions of what I think I want to share at this point, and see how the latest stage I might feel in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it multi-dimensional poetry is what that was. So yeah, and I didn't do the audience's applause, but imagine this audience applauding you. That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Kay. Asia, please, welcome to the stage.
Hello. So I haven't written in a while, but sorry, just a sec. What does that say? Okay, yeah, so I haven't written in a while, but with I don't know if you guys are aware, but last week and the past month or so as well, France has taken a whole new step towards banning the hijab and banning the veil. And it's one of those annoying political things that happens, and you're really kind of, because it's been a kind of sequence of events, it's build up, it's nothing new, and you kind of get sick of it, but there's always something in the back of your head that's like scratching to, just get something down on paper sometimes. And I think that's what happened. And yeah, so I'll read out what I wrote there. Okay, let me just get it up. My liberty. Born in a land that had hunted my mother tongue, the place I called home had fed me half full. But home had offered me liberty, you see, away from my mother tongue's encroaching mouth. She wanted to devour me, whilst home placed bread upon my father's table. Home told me my mother was wretched and my father barbaric. He pointed at my head and laughed. He said to me, "Is this the liberty I have afforded you?" I felt him undress me with his imperial gaze, as he had done my mother and her mother before her, buried back in mass graves, but I lived to be studied amongst the stolen. He pointed once more at my head and he said, "Take it off. Let me see my liberty." My liberty. Don't you see your mother tongue has almost eaten you whole? The plates on your table lie empty and your father stands starved. And then I watched carefully as the pit of fire in my mother tongue's belly fled up the walls of my home. He began to melt, to drip naked onto the table, a table sprawled with lies, only circled by beastly flies and centuries worth of unlawful cries. The fire stared back at me, and I saw that my mother tongue had been cradling me all this time. She had been lulling me to sleep as home attempted to thrust his liberty upon me. The mirrors began to liquefy, and I saw what was mine was still upon my head, draped like my mother's and her mother's before her, and raging amber my liberty wrapped itself around home like a noose. As he gasped for air, my mother tongue whispered something in his ear. It is justice I seek. The noose slipped loose and home lay naked like stone for all of eternity, for that was what he desired, and who was I to offer him my liberty? So yeah, that's that.
Azia, that was amazing. Whoa, do you have another, was that?
I have another one I could do. It's very short.
Oh, please, we need more. The audience demands it.
Thank you. This one is, this kind of shows the chaoticness of the writing process, because this one doesn't even have a title, but it's about the climate crisis, and I'm not as learned as I want to be in it, but I know that, you know, when it comes up, it's something that I definitely think about and try and implement in like how to figure out in my own life. But anyway, I wrote this poem. It's very short. I held up a sign to give the people water. A man came by the name of creation, parched and pitiful. He had never tasted water before. I held up a sign to give the people water, and creation appeared once more. He used the hands I did not have to dig at my well, and I found him no longer parched, yet still pitiful. Yeah, that's that.
Thank you so much. That was completely brilliant. And just, I don't know, the way that you're using irony and like kind of in this, it's incredibly, the My Liberty poem particularly, but also in the second poem, just like it's so bitter. And I was thinking when you were talking about the recent legislation in France that it's not shocking, it's not surprising, it's been a trajectory for so long, but your poem invokes anger, and we should feel angry. Like we shouldn't ever stop being angry about it, no matter how not surprising it is. Every time one of these violences is done to a group of people, yeah, we should, I think your poem really kind of, I don't know, it created that response that is necessary. So thank you so much for sharing both of those. And last but certainly not least, I would love to welcome to the stage Kashif.
Great, thanks. So I'm gonna read, I think I'm gonna read two poems. So they were both released in this anthology of trans poetics, actually, called We Want It All, published by Nightboat Books in the US. So the first one's called The Two Genders, on mangoes and watermelons. At the turn movement, too fast, where undergirding switch, locals affronted as magazine shoots innocuous glances and icy conditioning rays at the corner of virtuous assembly, colonial marking and attire, subgenre disattachment reverberates as legibility cleans, shards of overground warmth in midst of atmospheric assault, furtive retreats into rhythms, for knowing first mangoes of the season, the originary tale of the cultivar, golden and Alfonso judgments, crude shouts besmirching badamis, swelled noses and men in skull caps, wheeling juicy tales, compelling myths of origin, a kind of bare veniality, outpouring at another rotation, axial limits and guarded contrapuntal melody, where the rain comes, operation, voice regales, recounts, earnest and weighty, continentality, right? Multiple distriangulations and laughter, non-fluous sweet surprises in swift succinct strokes, at tip of watermelon knife, layering dreams past done. Okay. And the second one I wrote actually when I was in Istanbul, so there's a few references. Thresholds, after Mahmoud Darwish and Bülent Ersoy. Invisible, visible, the making before birth, as threshold of identity, absent in its point, bodily transaction, presented in prehistoric violence. Along the stretch of contemporary freedoms, voice transferred for bleeding presence. If half-cutter axis when trauma turned left and coaches stand at operations in check, Istanbul futures on bridging scars where wounds cauterize at the half-axial movement, modesty's mistrust, interpolative action, ready-made, already done, inaction, daily humdrum, urban milieu, sunflower pips, spread a salad, chorba and jajuk, chai sipped in ancient action from source to lip, traumatic recurrences papered over with lino, rock psych and Western garb, neo-Europe as post-Asia, polyglot returned as detransitioned exchange, goods revealed orally, pre-oratic stance wrapped in plastic paper bag running cherry tasting, vegan summoning in venture entrepreneurial ethno-business as linen stripes and faulty light switches, permeable archipelagic ardor as parabola paths intersect at disjunctive points. Turkic presence, London town, fecundity and social breakdown, waking deaths, unmarked problems, urban problems, passive polities, politically rife, resolute insolence, antagonistic elevations, unsuccessful navigations in colony collapses, culinary conditions for ripening palates, aesthetic form distributed, inordinate and detached, detailed debasements laundered in high-rise shores, widening paths, occidentosis in post-Islamicate tomfoolery, for lust of the hole in the wall, post-pro, pre-capitalist perfidy, performed resignations. I breathe confessional warmth. I eat, in essence, in pre-common taste. I wish to bodily frame, through the blessed quiz, the prelingual affectation, the movement of lingual judgment, and nominative justice, the face of one another, Browning health, subporous intent and ethical recognition, the canteen as relation, the disinterested hospitality as being brought into the fold, choice done away with, bedecked, in throes of wonder, guilt, FOMO, restlessness looking to us here, in content gliding possibility, after the event vibes. In awakening, softening cherry skins, taut, Socratic, growing burdens of speech imposition. Outed inferences in the growing toil. I was speaking rhetorically. The conversation kept on non-verbal. Communication continued, tanning slowly under kitsch sweets, dulling desires, caught into over leisure in multiple desires, tanning, consumerist in a bid for connection. Destructuring reminiscences as post-nostalgic, the conversing and absence after absence, a further coming down. Evading figures placed bodily straight and straight, machine gun colored administration in the head weighing down like the original subalterns, twisted queer lives multivalent, streets smart, weathered woman, service male, petit flaneur, casualized poet, prefabulatory gusto and angst. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kashif. That was incredibly. It's so ornate, palimpsestic, polyphonic, just kept moving, and I extremely appreciate the queering of the Desi marker of mangoes in the first poem. Yes, we need more of that. That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Kashif. And thank you, everyone. That was just completely, I wish that we, I wish I wasn't even talking at all and was just listening to you, but the format doesn't allow it. So we're going to conclude with some conversation. I have been enthusiastically blathering, so we have way less time than planned, and we're definitely going to finish at 9, so everyone can either go go back to class or get dinner or whatever, wherever you are, whatever the time zone. So I wanted to just, we're going to be all in the same, we should be in the same size now, the democracy, the panel. Yes, it emerges. Thank you so much, James. So I have some more questions for you. I wanted to just repeat the request to the audience, the invitation to the audience. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. And likewise, I feel very like, I wish that it was more possible to do kind of cross conversation within the panel, but if you have questions for each other, you know, please feel free to just shout them into the ether. Well, yeah, actually, I'll ask that before I get started with my kind of big, long, complicated, pre-planned questions. Do you have any responses that you wanted to offer each other, or questions, or anything like that?
I mean, I just wanted to just champion everybody's work. I think everybody's work was incredibly moving, but also very poignant to the times that we are in at the moment. And it's just, again, it just filled me with so much joy to hear so much riveting work that was read and shared through people's lived experiences. And I think that was just incredibly moving. So just wanted to champion everybody's work and champion the work that your work is doing in lives of others that receive that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I just use the chat a lot in terms of when I respond, because when I hear a poem or I hear a line, I feel like this need to be able to give something back, because being in a lot of performance spaces, and especially with spoken word, it's always like, I feel as if the audience is always a part of my performance sometimes, like in terms of the stage. And yeah, I definitely thought that listening to all of you was really interesting as well, in the ways in which you use different forms in order to express different aspects of the world or what's happening now. So really, thank you for sharing, everyone.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was so amazing just to hear the different ways that you're working with similar tools, but, you know, to create absolutely various textured, amazing things. So we have a question from Eva, who says, amazing work, thank you. Have you found you're writing differently for live performance now in the digital realm this year? Or was your realm always made for digital space to start with? Does anyone have a response to that? And no pressure if you don't too, because everyone will have quite a different feeling about this year.
I've got a pretty straightforward answer.
Yeah.
I've not been much of a spoken word artist per se. It's always been quite written work for me. So I think being able to kind of share that digitally has always been a thing I've been comfortable with. And then obviously this year with the Zoom calls, had the opportunity to do a bit more spoken word pieces over this format. So that's certainly been interesting, getting used to that. But I feel like there's not too much of a difference really, as long as you're confident in conveying the kind of message that you have in your piece. That's really what matters. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can jump in and add to that as well, because I see another question, if I will miss the chat function when we return to real life. And I feel as if at first when moving to Zoom, for me, I have been performing on stages prior to the pandemic. I became the New York City Youth Poet Laureate a few months before we became virtual, and I have been the US Youth Poet Laureate completely virtually. But I feel as if I haven't necessarily changed my art in order to meet the constraints of the virtual space, and instead I've tried to evolve the virtual space in order to meet my artivism and my work as well. Because other than poetry, I was in chorus for a decade. I played the guitar for 8, took theater classes, took film in sci-fi cinema, which is completely different than this, but it's another art form. So artistry has been a part of my life. And I feel like with the virtual space, even though it's different, it's still very much so a part of me and my identity. And when we move back into the spaces in which people will be able to meet and to be in person, I feel as if it'll be different, but I think we'll be able to even more so adapt the virtual space to have conversations like these, where I don't have to travel across oceans in order to meet other amazing poets like all of you.
That's great. Don't change your work, change the environment to suit your work. Yes, we all need to be doing that more. It's a power move. Kashif.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the things for me as a writer, as a poet, is actually you know, people have been talking about accessibility, but one of the great things is that you can access so many different readings now. And I can kind of be exposed to different stuff. And it means, like, you know, there was periods when I was going to things like almost every night in the peak of the pandemic. But I wasn't traveling, you know, if I was going to work, I wouldn't be able to really go out every evening. At least, you know, that was my, you know, that was my situation, right? So, but with this, I could, you know, I could just pop into a Zoom, I could pop out again, you know, if I only had half an hour. So I feel like that's really great, and I hope at least some of it continues, and certainly to get the cross-continental stuff as well, the cross-Atlantic has been really, really interesting. Like, there's some poets from the States I would never have seen over here, right? It just would never have happened. I could have looked at their videos, but you know, it's a different form, isn't it? So I feel like there's been positives for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Kay, have you found the digital era of this year kind of changing your work or your approach to how you work with other people?
I think it's first and foremost, I see my art as an opportunity to connect with young people and to empower them to create art. So that's my first usage of art for me. Is a tool for participatory kind of exploration. So in that regard, because I work with some of the most disenfranchised young people whose identification with art is not one that has been championed by the institutions where they are supposed to be educated, housed, and supported. So my role is to reintroduce them to a redefined version of what art looks like. So because of that, the online space has never really been a safe space for that group that I work with to really congregate and explore vulnerably the themes that a lot of my work challenges and evokes within young boys. So in that regard, there has been, you know, I guess, options for me to kind of explore that idea, but then looking at conversations around digital poverty, looking at the challenges that exist for certain young people's living conditions, and a lot of all these myriad challenges that were brought up when we think about actually how accessible is the digital space to a particular demographic. So for me, I have specifically chosen to keep a lot of my work face-to-face and in person because of those, you know, challenges that I speak of, and also because these young people tend to be young people who are deemed more vulnerable, so therefore they still had to be in school. Some of these young people, as we know, a lot of the global majority folks in this country are those who are mainly on the front line, so most of their children still had to go to school anyway. So by default, most of the work that I ever was still creating and working collaboratively with young people was still having to be in a face-to-face capacity because the digital space is not safe for everybody and not everybody has equal accessibility to the digital space. And in that regard, for me to keep my work completely accessible, I really chose to do majority of the work that I delivered, especially with and alongside young people and in a person capacity. I still did a lot of other things online for more teachers and lots of other folks in a creative way, but I think majority of the demographic that I spent a lot of my time working with, I kept a lot of that in a face-to-face capacity.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, that's such an important thing to mention, and how easy it is to generalize about certain things of this year. But you're completely right that for loads of people, life had to go on as usual in some sense, and this digital divide or digital poverty, it feels like, whereas previously the idea that the internet, for example, is just as much a right as clean running water, it doesn't feel like that ludicrous now, does it? Whereas like 2 years ago, that seemed to be a ludicrous claim. Oh, we have a question from Michael Black, and maybe we'll round out by kind of singing the names of the people that inspire us. So Michael asks, obviously I'll be reading everyone on the panel, good, and watching videos and listening and all of those other things. I'm wondering which poets you would all recommend at this moment.
For me, I mean, besides the lists of people that we all kind of go to, Maya Angelou is one of my favorites. But there's another poet. He's based in Washington, D.C. His name is Clint Smith. He's an incredible poet. I mean, he also has some TED Talks, but I love the complexity and the dexterity to his work. And he also is written as well as a spoken word poet, and he navigates both quite immaculately, and he explores incredible themes. So yeah, Clint Smith is somebody that I would say on a contemporary scale, but then Maya Angelou forever, for sure.
Great, thank you. Kashif?
Yeah, so one of the people that we had actually at one of our latest reading on Saturday, who blew me away, was Tongo Isaac Martin. Everyone should check out his books, but also he's got a couple of collections, but also his performances are incredible. And he does this kind of, I think he does it off memory, but he goes for like 20-25 minutes, just like full at you machine gun style. And yeah, he's based in the States, actually. He's from San Francisco. I believe he's a San Francisco Poet Laureate at the moment. So yeah, everyone should check him out for sure.
Amazing, thanks. And maybe the 87 Press reading will be on YouTube shortly.
Shortly, yeah.
So sure. You can check it out there as well. Asia, you mentioned Suhaima Manzoor-Karam. Anyone else that you'd like to give a shout out to, or your forever poets that you would like to name?
Just someone I had a look at today. I was doing, so one of Thawra's posts as a magazine is we look at like a revolutionary of the week, and someone I was looking at today was actually Audre Lorde, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with her work. Her kind of talking about, she covers everything from race, gender, sexuality to class and feminism, and I think I was just reading up on some of her work and it blows me away every time. And I think even though like her work is from decades back, it's something that it's still relevant today. I mean, that's the kind of issue in itself, I guess. But yeah, so I was having a look at her work and I thought she was really good.
Yeah, absolutely, a forever poet right there. And it's never too late to read her if you haven't yet. So thank you for that. And Meera, what about you?
Well, there's definitely a lot, but in terms of like when we were talking about Maya Angelou and Audre Lorde, I think I have to add Lucille Clifton for a second as well into the mix, and Jericho Brown, Joy Harjo, all of these different poets who have definitely inspired me in the past and currently as well. But in terms of poets that I've seen recently, I think that there are many young poets within Urban Word NYC that you should definitely watch. If you just search up the organization in general, you'll find many of their works, and I think it's important to acknowledge them as well. In button poetry, Cupsy, all of these different competitions, the poets there are very inspirational. There's no other words for me, because they were the ones who actually inspired me to start writing poetry, because I really saw how poetry can have a social impact through them. So I definitely think if you want to hear spoken word as videos as well, you should check out those different websites.
Thank you. That's an amazing selection. And again, you can subscribe to those YouTube channels, right? And keep up to date and feel like, yeah, you're kind of on the finger on the pulse, ears on the pulse with the spoken word poetry in the States. That's brilliant. Thank you. And thank you also for just, I feel like, giving us the conclusion that we need about just about the sociality, the community, the power that's at the heart of all that, because that's obviously what we've been celebrating this evening / afternoon. So I think with that, we should, I should thank you for just being such inspirational. You can't underuse that word. You've been completely inspirational, all of you. And thank you for reading, sharing your words, your ideas, your care and passion. It's been just such a privilege to get to hear you and also to experience you responding to each other in such beautiful ways. Thank you, attendees. I can't see you. I can see your list of names, but I know you're there. And thank you for your questions, Aoife and Michael. And thank you, Wizard James. I hope you don't mind that I've been calling you Wizard, but you've been an amazing help and support. Thank you. And yeah, I think we'll say good night. Thanks so much, everyone, and bye.